London was originally a Roman city. Join me as I tell its story, from the beginning to the very end. I'm going to explore the lives of everyday Roman Londoners, with exclusive access from some of the world's leading experts.
Mithraism is about light and dark, life and death, and there would have been dramatic theatrical effects.
Shining new light on the lives of London's earliest inhabitants.
There was no grave goods, there's just literally these few bones. And they've revealed so much, it's amazing.
This is Life and Death in Roman London. The story of Roman London begins right here around AD 50. Behind me I have the Royal Exchange, to my right is the Bank of England, and then here we have Cornhill and there Threadneedle Street. At some stage between Caesar's 55 and 54 BC incursions to Britain and the later Claudian invasion in AD 43, the Romans established a mercantile trading post right here on a gravel terrace on the high ground above the River Thames. Then it expanded probably at the beginning of the 2nd century as it grew onto Ludgate Hill where St Paul's Cathedral is today, and then later as it grew again into the 3rd century it expanded onto Tower Hill behind me.
The area where the City of London, the Roman City of London was built would actually have been a pretty sort of heavily wooded area, and the really distinctive and different thing was the River Thames. It was a much wider river. There were no embankments narrowing it. So at high tide, we think the river would have been almost a kilometre wide. So the water extended from 100 metres more into the city than it does now, and all the way to Borough Tube Station. That would have all been underwater at high tide.
One of the amazing things about this location is the fact that we're still surrounded by legacies of the Roman world to this very day in the architecture. Because if you look at the top of the Bank of England there, the lady you can see is Juno Munitas. Now Juno Munitas was the manifestation of the goddess Juno associated with money and mercantile trading. And the words we use today for mint and money come from the fact that the original mint in Rome was established next to her temple on top of the Capitoline Hill above the Forum Romanum in Rome, and here she is today above the Bank of England. First and foremost, Roman London was an emporium, as we would style it today, which is a mercantile town. So if you were exporting goods from anywhere in the continent, it would first come into London, and then it would be broken down into smaller loads and put on other boats and then sent around the entire southeast down the river networks and around the coast.
Maritime trade was critical for the success, really, of the early Roman city and town. The reasons the Romans conquered Britain was partly for the materials that could come out. Those include wool, metals like tin, people as slaves. All of this was going out, but then coming in from the continent were all the things that made Roman life possible and a bit more pleasant. So, you know, wine, olive oil, glass, everything that made Roman life sort of special and enabled trade, really.
If you were living in Roman London, one of the structures which you would be most aware of is London Bridge. And London Bridge for the Romans was broadly along the line of modern London Bridge, right behind me just here. The Romans built London Bridge where they did because it was the first easily accessible crossing place where they could construct something like a really significant bridge as you go upriver on the River Thames.
Well, the first Roman bridge, or the first Roman crossing, probably would have been a military pontoon bridge, so a sort of temporary bridge with sort of floating caissons and things. But then we know from archaeological evidence that a wooden bridge is constructed about 52 AD. And the reason it was so important to get a bridge in was the whole point of the location of London is it's the first point up the Thames estuary where there's enough dry ground on the south bank and on the north bank to build a good road network, and it's the first place where the river can really be crossed. The reason that is so important is it's connecting all the trade that's coming in from the south coast across the Thames estuary, linking with the port in London, and then fuelling the conquest of the rest of Britain to the north and west.
But the Thames wasn't the only significant river running through Roman London. The Walbrook was a vital waterway which bisected Roman London in half. On one side you had all the fine public buildings, and on the other side you had all the horde polloi where the normal people lived. However, today you wouldn't know it existed because it's been canalised and covered up. The only section you can see is this right here. This is a sculptured water feature designed by Christina Iglesias to mark the location of the Walbrook stream, which is now buried beneath the monumental buildings that cover London's city centre today. The Walbrook, however, has proven vital for archaeologists wanting to learn more about the city's Roman past. Excavations from this lost river revealed a plethora of exciting Roman artefacts preserved within the waterlogged soils. To find out more, I've headed to the Roman Gallery in the Bloomberg London building at the centre of the City of London to meet Dr. Sophie Jackson, a lead archaeologist on the excavations. Well, Sophie, this is one of my favourite installations in the whole of London, reflecting the Roman city. What can you tell us about the context in which all of these artefacts were found?
Well, these artefacts are just a small selection of the thousands and thousands that we found here. We had to excavate before Bloomberg put their new building up, and the archaeology here is particularly deep. It goes down about 7 or 8 metres. The tablets are the most amazing and just the best find from this site. Before we excavated this site, there were about 19 wax writing tablets from Roman London that had decipherable messages in. We found 405 fragments on this site. And 87 of them so far have been deciphered. Even if they're tiny little bits of text, they give us such amazing clues about the people of London, what they were up to, what society was like. And there are some really, really special ones in this case. This one is actually a deed of sale between 2 freedmen, and one is recording that he owes him 105 denarii for goods delivered. But the brilliant thing about it, it's dated. It's got the date, which you can work out, as the 8th of January, AD 57. It's the earliest manuscript, it's the earliest piece of writing from this country.
That
it's
is
the first piece of writing.
Absolutely astonishing.
And what is brilliant about it, it's been found in the City of London. You can imagine what Mike Bloomberg thought when he found out that he's got the earliest piece of writing and it's a financial document. And what's lovely about it, it tells us just how much of the legal and financial framework was in place really only about 10 or 11, 12 years after London is established. Yeah. So it's a really, really important and early document.
By 60 AD, London had already risen to become the biggest settlement in Britain. The city had experienced a remarkable and rapid rise, but disaster was quick to follow. In AD 60, the Iceni queen Boudica led a massive revolt against the Romans, a revolt that quickly set its sights on London.
It was a catastrophic attack and assault on London. Basically, the whole town is set on fire, and you can see this in the archaeological record. It's one of the most amazing things. There's this red layer, burnt bricks, burnt timbers, but you also find evidence of violence. We've excavated pits and trenches where pottery and possessions have been smashed and thrown in the pits, and then the burnt debris has gone in on top.
Boudica's destruction of London was total. Victims of the onslaught numbered in the thousands. The revolt, however, would ultimately be put down, and in its wake, the Romans refused to abandon London and its vital trading location. They established a fort on modern-day Fenchurch Street to emphasise the point. The Romans were there to stay, and London's revival was set in motion.
Immediately after Boudica's revolt, probably not a lot's happening. There's regrouping and clearing up, and the military come back in. But then quite rapidly, there's new investment in London. A really, really massive quayside and port facilities are built in sort of 63, 64 AD. By 70 AD, we've got the Roman amphitheatre being built. We have the Huggin Hill Baths, a big public bath complex. So there's investment in London, making the point that this city, this town is going to survive.
Artefacts from the Walbrook excavations only prove this, especially the remarkably preserved tablets. Sophie, what can the tablets tell us about Roman London's recovery from the Buddan Revolt?
Oh, well, they're really, really helpful for that. Well, first of all, this one here, which dates from the sort of mid-60s, late 60s, this is so amazing for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the first ever, the earliest mention of London in history anywhere. So there we go, we see Londinio.
That's incredible.
And then secondly, the name Mercantius is actually a Celtic name. Oh. So this again is an early tablet, probably about 65 post-Buddan, but we have letters being addressed to Celtic people in London. And the lovely thing about these tablets, even some of them where they don't really say very much, just the name can give you a clue as to who they are, what they're doing. It tells us that Mercantius is in London and London is re-establishing. But there's another really good one, which is actually on loan to the BM British Museum at the moment. That's dated to the 21st of October, AD 62, and it's a record of an order from one merchant requesting a delivery of 20 loads of provisions from St Albans, Verulamium, to London. Right. And that tells us, it's one of these lovely clues, it tells us that both towns are back on their feet. They're delivering 20 loads of stuff, we don't know what the stuff is, but from St Albans to London.
That is amazing. Living alongside these merchants in a recovering London were also soldiers.
These spearheads are very, very obviously military, and we have quite a lot of those from here, and also arrowheads. And then we have what's really amazing, lots of little fragments of armour. Those little hinges would have been fixed to leather or metal plates and forming parts of the sort of body armour. So they're really, really important, really diagnostic of the military being here. Which is interesting, because when you go to most Roman towns and cities, usually you don't get any sort of military presence within the town, but here there's quite a lot. So this is like your full-fat Roman legionary right in the middle of Roman London. Yeah, absolutely. And it's often a question about was London founded? Was it a military foundation? Was it a mercantile? A trading place? Well, it's both, actually. I think that's what the archaeological evidence tells us. They're here, they're very, very present, but they're not running the show.
So, who was running the show? Well, that would be the Roman governor, who would have lived in a monumental palace. Where this palace was located in London remains debated, but it may well have been situated somewhere near modern-day Cannon Street railway station. This palace, however, was not the only monumental building built right at the heart of a revived Roman London post-Boudica. Other hallmark structures also began to appear, the remains of which can be found in some quite peculiar places beneath London's streets today. At the heart of every Roman town and city were two structures in every single one, and Roman London is no exception. These are the Basilica, which is the official law courts, and the Forum, which is the official market. And here, beneath Leadenhall Market, in a barber shop, is a pier from the Basilica in Roman London. This structure dates to between AD 70 and AD 120, when the Romans really monumentalised their new provincial capital after defeating Boudica.
The Forum is present in all Roman towns, and it's really the key marketplace. There are workshops and shops and market activities in the middle, and this is effectively a large open public space. And then the Basilica is where the lawyers live, the town administration lives, the law courts. So it's all really about the running of the town, and that all happens in the Basilica.
The Romans were master builders, and they used the same building techniques everywhere across their empire. You've got stone foundations, you've got a tile wall, and it's all linked together with Roman concrete. That's how well this wall was built. It's still with us 2,000 years later. Roman London had a new lease of life. These monumental buildings dotted the eastern side of the River Walbrook. But what about the ordinary people of this revived Roman Emporium? Those inhabitants who largely lived west of the Walbrook. In a Roman town or city, every town house would have a fairly similar layout. So you would come in off the street into an atrium, which would have an impluvium pool in the middle. Then in the middle of the house, as you walked through the house, which tended to be fairly long and thin, you'd have a tabulinium, which is where the master of the house would meet all the important people he wanted to meet on a given day, but also a triclinium dining room. And then at the back of the house, you'd have a peristyle. And behind me, there's a recreation of a triclinium dining room from the 1st century AD. If you were to look at any recreation of a Roman town or city, you would assume all the buildings are built out of stone, but they're not. Nearly all the buildings, including many of the fine townhouses, are actually built with stone foundations, but are built from wattle and daub. So they would be painted to look as though they had stone exteriors and they'd have painted plaster interiors. That's exactly what we have here in this recreation of a triclinium dining room. So you can tell it's early Roman London, not later Roman London, because the mosaic floor is fairly primitive. This particular building on which the recreation is based was burnt in the Hadrianic fire in the AD 120s. This fire appears to have been one of a series of calamities that suddenly struck a revived Roman London in the early 2nd century. The evidence is far from clear, but there are clues as to what might have happened. I'm standing here on Noble Street near the Museum of London, next to the second phase of Roman fortification of London. It's the Cripplegate Fort. So you have the first stage, which was the fort built at Fenchurch Street after the Buddan Revolt. This fort was built in the AD 120s after Hadrian became the emperor in AD 117. Now at that time, because many Romans didn't expect Hadrian to become the emperor, there was trouble across the empire, and there was trouble in London, and there were 3 events which marked this trouble. Firstly, you had the finding of hundreds of beheaded skulls in the Walbrook Valley. Secondly, it looks as though there was a major fire in Roman London and the whole of Roman London was burnt down. Interestingly, that fire seems to have been the fronts of the buildings burnt, not the backs, so it was a deliberate torching event. And then thirdly, you have the building of the Cripplegate Fort. So it seems that you have an insurrection, Roman London burning down, and then when the Roman military come back in the AD 120s, they build this Cripplegate Fort, which you can see right here behind us. This is the line of the Cripplegate Fort. It's an early Roman fort, it's plain card shaped, and you can tell it's also got internal towers, because there are the foundations of the internal towers visible today. So what do I mean by a plain card shaped fort? Well, Roman forts came in 4 sizes. At the top end, you have a legionary fortress for about 5,500, 6,000 men. So in Britain, that will be at Caerleon, in southeast Wales, that will be at Chester, and that will be in York. Next, below that, you have a vexillation fort for about 1,000 men, which is this fort here. It's always plain card shaped. And in Roman Britain, other examples would include Houston's on Hadrian's Wall and Bindelander near Hadrian's Wall. Any troubles that London experienced during Hadrian's reign were quickly dealt with, and soon enough, London once again bounced back, entering a golden age in its Roman history. One of its greatest attractions were the games. Behind me you have the religious boundary of the original Roman city, which later became the land wall built by Septimius Severus. And because you're far away from the grand public buildings on Cornhill, we've now jumped over towards Ludgate Hill, you have behind us the remains of the Roman amphitheatre in London. And the arena wall is marked by the line of stones curving right behind me.
In 1987, the Roman amphitheatre was found in London, and it was very, very carefully excavated. And we know there were 2 phases of the amphitheatre. The first amphitheatre was built in 70 AD, and then it was expanded in the early 2nd century. For London, it was quite a big structure. It could hold 7,000 people. I mean, compared to the Colosseum in Rome, it was absolutely puny, but for London, it was a big thing. And we know from the archaeological evidence and the finds that there would have been animal fights going on. They would have let wild animals fight against each other. It was probably the place, rather gruesomely, where prisoners were put to death, either by wild animals or by execution. And also, as a sort of real highlight, there would be gladiatorial combats.
One of the key experiences of living in Roman London would have been going to the public baths. So the Romans, being the Romans, did the same everywhere across the empire, including in Roman London. This is a representation of a Roman public baths on Upper Thames Street in the City of London today. We've got very good archaeological data which can show us exactly what this experience of going to the Roman public baths would have been like, because we've actually found the wall plaster. So part of your experience going to the Roman baths in London would have been to see beautifully painted artwork on the walls like this.
There were several bathhouses that have been discovered in Roman London. The main public bath was a bathhouse built in Huggin Hill in 70 AD. It actually went out of use relatively quickly, which is surprising. There may be another near where Cannon Street railway station is, and there's another bathhouse in the east of the city at Billingsgate. And all the bathhouses were positioned mostly on the sort of slope down to the river, presumably to use gravity to actually get the water to run in at some pressure.
You will begin the public bathing experience by going into the tepidarium, the cool room. You would then go into the caldarium, the hot room, and then you'd finish your bathing experience by closing your pores because you'd jump into a freezing cold frigidarium plunge pool.
What appears to have happened with the bathhouses is that there's early public investment in, government funding the building of these public buildings, but then later in the Roman period they appear to become more private institutions in the backyards of people's houses, or perhaps for a select few, not for everyone.
London began to thrive like never before, with people venturing to this wealthy metropolis from all over the Roman Empire.
We know quite a lot about Roman London's inhabitants in the 2nd century, when it's at sort of peak population. We think there were probably about 30,000 people living in London. And we know that they came from a whole wide range of places and what we'd call classes now. People coming in from Gaul, from France, what's modern France, from Spain, from Italy, but also a lot of native British people who've assimilated with the Roman civilization, really. So it's a really, really mixed society, really mixed culture, and with all different grades of people sort of mingling together.
One critical way through which we've been able to learn more about Roman London's population are through the burials. To find out more, I caught up with the Museum of London's Senior Curator of Archaeology, Dr. Rebecca Redfern. So Rebecca, where did the Romans bury their dead in Roman London?
Well, like every other town in the Roman Empire, they were instructed by law to bury outside of the Roman walls. And then we also have quite a few burials that we would call clandestine burials. So there is a man who was put headfirst down a well.
Really?
And
My
there's
word.
lots of kind of bits of people that we find in rubbish heaps and in ditches and things. So it's, although they're supposed to be, the majority of people are buried outside the Roman walls, and they're on the roads leading out of London, and that links to part of the Roman funerary ritual where by reading someone's tombstone is an act of commemoration. As you would have gone into Roman London, you would have been going through all of the cemeteries. They would have been brightly painted. It would have had people's names and where they came from. So we can learn a lot about the people of Roman London from that evidence.
And are there any specific sort of cemeteries that we know about, sort of around Roman London?
We've divided them according to the compass points, because there's so much development in London. You have lots of individual sites that actually all together form big cemeteries. So you've got northern, southern, east and west. And they do seem to have different characteristics. So the eastern cemeteries, you've got lots of people buried with things that we don't necessarily find elsewhere, and some appear to go into like the 4th century, early 5th century, and others don't. That might be just because it hasn't been excavated yet, or else that's just the nature of the settlement changing over time.
And Rebecca, were people buried in different ways sort of throughout the chronology of Roman London?
Yes, and that's a reflection of where people are coming from. So very early on, we have these incredibly wealthy, high-status cremations of men, and they are clearly being buried in a Mediterranean style. One is buried in an Egyptian pot, an Egyptian stone pot. So they studied the stone and found that it came from Egypt. Right. So that would have had to have been brought to Britain, and is clearly someone of very, very high status. And then you have a cremation, and the thing to remember with cremation is it's actually the expensive option, because you need to have bought all the wood, and it takes a lot of wood. It's a whole very, very, very lengthy funeral tradition compared to putting someone in a coffin and burying them. We have people in wooden coffins as well. We also have some very high status burials, like the Spitalfields Roman woman, where they're buried in lead coffin, and those lead coffins have been brought to London probably from elsewhere in Britain. And then we also have stone sarcophaguses. A couple of those appear to have been imported. And we know that they're made on the continent or elsewhere in Britain. They've normally got like a picture of a woman's face on them, but sometimes the face isn't finished. So they were kind of like made to a certain point, and then obviously like you say, oh yes, I'll have that sarcophagus, and they'll be like, okay, what does this person look like? And finish it off, but it didn't happen in this case. It's really remarkable, but it just shows that that exchange of funerary traditions, like with Spitalfield's Roman woman, we know that she's also, her body's been embalmed, not like Egyptian embalming. It's where they would rub the body with oils and spices, and where that's been studied by colleagues at Bradford University, they were able to show that these are pine resin, and there's also yellow staining on some of her neck bones as well, and that's again from the treatment of the body. And then at the same time you have a lot of very local customs, like the traditions of where they've come from, and including other parts of Britain as well.
So that to me speaks about this sort of cosmopolitan nature of Roman London, where a lot of the population weren't British at all, but came from across the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and you can see that quite a lot through the inscriptions. So you've got a lot of military who are recorded through tombstones. They were being buried in a very formalised, very recognisable way within the military community.
We think that London was attractive, or people were coming to London from all over the empire because it offered economic opportunity. It's a new market for you to sell your goods or to take goods from this country into the rest of the Roman Empire. There's economic opportunity, but also people whose job is to administer and enforce Roman civilization.
So this is somebody of African descent who grew up in Roman London.
Yeah, which is fantastic, because this is the type of evidence that we don't get in the inscriptions, that we don't get in the letters. So the only evidence we have of different population affiliations, is how we would describe it forensically, is by looking at their skeleton and then adding kind of that DNA and that isotope evidence in to create a picture. Because there was no grave goods, there's just literally these few bones all jumbled up, and they've revealed so much, it's amazing. And
one thing I actually noticed is how worn those teeth are there, so that must have been very painful.
Inside your tooth, so you've got a hard white crown, and that's really tough, but it gets worn out because the grain they're eating, you get bits of stone incorporated in it, so it's like a sandpaper on your tooth because of how they're grinding it, and then that exposes the brown soft dentine, and that's like really, that would be really sensitive.
Goodness me. And what were they taking for sort of pain relief for that?
There's lots of recommendations in the medical literature written in the Mediterranean, and they're saying, you know, things like poppy syrup to kind of relieve pain, and all sorts of other various crazy medical concoctions.
So poppy syrup, which is an opiate.
Yes.
So basically they're taking opiates for toothache.
Victorians did stranger things, so
there
why
you go.
not?
From early foundations on Cornhill to Boudicca's reckoning, and then to a remarkable revival, the rise of London is a fascinating topic to learn about. Within a century, this Roman foundation had risen to become the new capital of Britannia. But tough tests lay ahead for Roman London. Its story has only just begun. In the last episode, we covered the rise of Roman London up to the end of the 2nd century. From the city's earliest piece of preserved writing,
it's the earliest mention of London in history anywhere. You see Londinio.
That's incredible. To some bizarre Roman medicine.
In the medical literature, they're saying things like poppy syrup to relieve pain.
They're taking opiates for toothache. Now we're going to look at Roman London's later history and what ultimately happened to this beating heart of ancient Britannia. Traces of London's Roman roots can be found tucked away in peculiar places beneath London streets, but other features are hiding in plain sight. We're standing here outside one of the few surviving sections of the land wall of Roman London. And the story of this wall begins in AD 193, the year of the 5 emperors. The Roman Empire was convulsed by a series of civil wars, and at the end of the year, the last man standing, the emperor, was Septimius Severus, born in North Africa in Leptis Magna, died in AD 211 in York in Britain. But at the beginning of his reign, he found that he had a number of usurpers potentially challenging him for the throne. So therefore he targeted them one by one, and the key one, the most difficult for him to beat, was the British governor based here in London called Clodius Albinus. And Clodius Albinus actually made a power play for the throne, and Severus had to bring his armies all the way to Gaul to fight a titanic civil war battle at Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in AD 197, which Severus only just won. And having beaten Albinus, he had him beheaded, he mounted his stallion and then trampled ceremoniously over Albinus's body. And then he decided that he'd need to send a message to the people in London who'd supported Albinus the usurper. So he sent his generals to London and he told them to build the first wall in Roman London, not to keep the bad guys out, but to tell the people of London what would happen to them if they misbehaved again. And he built this 3.2 kilometre land wall circuit, and here it is still today. Still the Roman facing stone, and that's ragstone, which came from quarries 127 kilometres away in the Medway Valley. Sent to London, then built with an outer face, an inner face, and then you have 5 levels of stone built, and then at the end of 5 levels of stone you have a tile bonding layer. And the tile bonding layer actually is used by the Romans everywhere across their empire. And that tile bonding layer, because it's from the Mediterranean, is designed to give the wall flex if there's an earthquake. Now clearly you don't get many earthquakes in London, but the Romans did the same everywhere across their empire, and here it is to send a message to the Londoners to behave. On this map behind me, you can actually see the outline of the route used to build the Severn land wall in London. So it's 3.2 kilometres long. It's this blue line here. Starts here, where we're standing now at Tower Hill Tube Station, and then goes all the way around up to London Wall, then goes to the Guildhall, and then goes to where the Museum of London is today, which is there, and then it goes down to the line of the Old Bailey and then back down to the river. So that's 3.2 kilometres long, built by Septimius Severus about AD 199. Thanks to Severus, London was now surrounded by this monumental city wall. And as the 3rd century progressed, more and more structures would be built within. One such building was a mysterious subterranean temple, constructed under what is today the Bloomberg European headquarters in the centre of the City of London. To find out more, I'm meeting up with the Museum of London archaeologist Dr. Sophie Jackson. So Sophie, we're in this incredible space near the Walbrook, and it's a Mithraeum, isn't it? Now, what can you tell us about how it was actually found?
Well, it was a bit of a miracle it was found, actually. This part of the city was really badly bombed during the Blitz. A small group of archaeologists were got together just after the war to investigate these bomb sites and just to make a record of the archaeology before reconstruction started. And so they came here because they wanted to record the Walbrook, the deposits in the Walbrook River. And they put the trenches in, just a few trenches, and one of them miraculously clipped the curved apsidal end. They couldn't investigate it immediately, that was in 1952, so they came back in 1954, just before construction of this big new office development started. And during the summer of 1954 they uncovered the ground plan, all of this, got the full extent of it, but they didn't know what it was. They thought it was a Roman temple, didn't know who it was dedicated to, and it was actually the last day of excavation, September the 18th, 1954, that the diagnostic piece came up. It was the head of Mithras, was found perhaps by a workman, and that was it. On the last possible moment of the excavation, they worked out that this was a temple to Mithras.
And what does the finding of this head tell us about the date when the Mithraeum was built? The
excavation was really, really well done, and there's lots of very good dating evidence from coins and so on here. So we know this building was built in about 250 AD, so quite late on, 200 years nearly after the founding of London.
So what do we know about the religious worship which would have taken place in this space?
Well, we know a bit about what went on in this building, but not very much, and that's because Mithraism was secretive, it was a mystery cult. Members of the cult were initiated in and sworn to secrecy, so there's no liturgy or written description of what actually happened in here. We have to piece together the archaeological evidence. We know from other Mithraea that these buildings are often sunken, and this one was. There was 3 steps down into it. It was probably windowless, just lit by candles. It would have been quite a sort of spooky and scary experience. There would have been columns. There were actually 7 pairs of columns in here, and 7 is a significant number. But we know from a famous Mithraea in Ostia in Italy that there were 7 grades, and we think the 7 columns here are obviously indicative, referencing those grades. So if you were a beginner, the lowest grade was a raven. You probably sat near the door, and the pater, or the father of the cult, would have been at the business end with the altar and the Mithraic sculpture. This is the threshold, the entranceway, and amazingly the cast iron fitting for the doors, where the doors would have swivelled, are still there. They're still surviving.
And what do we know about the individuals who would have actually worshipped in this building?
They'd have all been men.
Really?
We know the cult was really, really popular with men in the army, civil servants and merchants. These are people who are moving around the Roman Empire, being posted to different places, and Therese obviously offered a spiritual power and special knowledge, but also a great networking opportunity. So if you probably wanted to get on in the army, it was good to be invited to be a Mithraist and to join this particular club.
In this space, is there one area which would have been the centre of the worship?
Yes, well, the centre would have been directed towards the altar. In this case, it's the west end, and you can see in here we've reconstructed or given the impression of the cult statue, which would have been at this end.
Right.
It would have been really, really dramatic. The head of Mithras, which was the sculpture which was found on the last day of excavation, would have been on this statue. The rest of it would have probably been made of plaster of Paris, and the hands might have been marble, the head was marble, but the rest was a bit fake.
Right.
It had all been painted, of course. Mithraism is about light and dark, life and death, and there would have been dramatic theatrical effects. You know, we know from other Mithraea there would have been spaces for curtains to be withdrawn or pulled, and there are 4 sort of sockets behind the cult statue here for lamps, for lighting, that sort of stuff.
Sort of like religious theatre.
It is. You can imagine. This would have been very dark. There would have been smells of incense, candle lit, the lights behind there, with the pater leading the whole business at the front.
For the Romans, religion could operate on 2 levels. Firstly, you have the worship of the classical gods, so here represented by, for example, Minerva and Neptune. And if you're worshipping the classical gods, you're not participating in the worship. The actual altar is outside of the classical temple, and the priests do the service, but you do not participate. What you're asking there, in terms of transacting with the deity, is for them not to interfere with your everyday life. The last thing you want is to have this monstrous deity, Jupiter for example, twanging the thread of your life, because anything could go wrong. But then you have another level of religion as well. These are the congregatory religions from the East. So for example, Christianity, Judaism, and the worship of Mithras, Mithraism. So in this space, it's clearly associated with the worship of Mithras, but is there any other evidence whatsoever that other religions were also celebrated here?
Yes, there is. It looks like the building was remodelled in about 320 AD. The columns disappeared, and we think it was rededicated to Bacchus, so it became a temple to Bacchus. When it ceased to be a Mithraeum, somebody dug a pit, which would have been just around here, and they actually buried all of the cult statues associated with Mithras and the other statues which had been associated with the Mithraic phase, and they buried them there. In other buildings where Mithraea have been replaced by churches, often the statues are smashed up, but here they were treated with respect, and thank goodness they were, because they are the finest Roman sculptures that have ever been found in this country. These were objects which had real power and real meaning, but also wanting to sort of almost purify the space and clear out the past religion before starting to worship Bacchus.
And here we have the actual objects themselves. So all these heads of deities were buried in the ground reverentially, almost to draw a close on the previous worship. But obviously there were other religions at the same time which also fell out of use, as it were. For example, behind me you can see this amazing marble bust of Serapis, which is also an Eastern deity, but which was also buried at the same time as these objects from the worship of Mithras. So how did the worship of Mithras, this Eastern cult, end up being practiced in London?
The first Mithraea sort of appear in the 1st century AD, and it used to be thought that this was the Persian religion which had travelled sort of westwards.
Right.
But actually we think now that the Romans, somebody borrows the iconography of this earlier religion to give it a sense of mystery and gravitas or whatever. But it appears first in places like modern Turkey and then into Rome, and then it takes a few hundred years to get across the empire. But there are 4 Mithraea known in the UK, and they're all obviously later. They're the sort of 2nd, 3rd century.
Are there any other elements of building structure near here which are associated with the Mithraeum but which aren't on display?
Yes, we were absolutely blown away when we were doing the early investigations here, because we did a trench just out there beyond the entrance here to where the Mithraeum was, and we found surviving remains of a sort of vestibule of what could be called a narthex officially,
Really?
Which could have been effectively the changing room where you got dressed up for what was going on in here. A few years ago we did an excavation on the other side of Walbrook,
Right.
and we found remains of a large Roman building,
Right.
and we think that that may have been the house, the residence of perhaps the person who built this Mithraeum. So this is actually a private building in the back garden of somebody's big house. There's an inscription on what's called the Tauroctrony panel, this bull slaying scene, which references Ulpius Silvanus, who's a veteran of the 2nd Augustan Legion.
Fascinating.
And it says he built this and fulfilled his vow. So it's possible that this is Ulpius Silvanus's house on the other side of the modern Walbrook Street, and he may have been the person who built this. So it's another fantastic link to a real person.
And you can see here this classic Mithraic scene with Mithras killing the bull, but also these other animals attacking the bull as well. There's a dog there, there's a scorpion, there's a snake. This is all associated with the iconography of the worship of Mithras. Also, the graffiti on either side. So it's Severinus, and then it says there he's from Legio to Augusta. It's amazing to think that if not for this inscription, we would never have known of Severinus. The man was one of many well-off Romans who opted to settle in this thriving city and live rather luxurious lifestyles, clues about which have been revealed through the archaeology. To this recreation of a triclinium, which dates to around AD 300, if you look at the quality of the mosaic, this is a really fine mosaic. The story of Roman London's moved on. It's now this very successful mercantile city. We can see here we're recreating the box flue tiles from inside the walls, which means this house has a hypercaust. It's got central heating. But also, if we move this way, we can see some evidence of everyday life in this house around AD 300. One of the key things for me are these lamps. It's worth remembering that glass is very expensive in the Roman world, so windows are going to be very small. So therefore, to give you light inside this amazing Roman townhouse, you're going to need lamps all over the place. Tucked away around this corner is one of my favourite artefacts from the whole of Roman London, and it's this. It's a metal makeup canister. It was found with the makeup still in it. And so we could analyse what Roman makeup was made of. And this makeup comprised animal fat, starch from ground bulbs, and tincture of tin. So just imagine the person wearing this makeup. They will be glowing this tincture of tin, making them almost sparkle. But very few things speak to me like this makeup pot, because the makeup pot tells me who was using it in Roman London. And it even has their finger marks in it. That is absolutely incredible. Another way that we can learn more about these high-status individuals are through their burials. To find out more, I'm meeting the Museum of London's Senior Curator of Archaeology, Dr. Rebecca Redfern.
Looking at the skeleton actually provides us with a huge amount of information about this person. They're female, they've got really wide sciatic notches, and also the shape of their cranium tells me that as well. Her upper leg bone has been cut, and that's her femur, and we took a bit of bone out of the femur in order to date her burial, because she's one of the very late Roman burials that we have. So we wanted to kind of see exactly when she was being buried, and that came out as the early 400s,
Wow.
late 300s. We also looked at areas of her pelvis, so this bit here, and that can tell us how old she was when she died. So she was about 36 to 45.
Okay.
We don't know what she died from because nothing came back in the DNA analysis about that. But what it did tell us was that she actually has light brown hair. Fortunately, it didn't work for her eye colour or her skin colour, but it worked for the hair colour, so we know that she's got light brown hair. You may have noticed that on her jaw there's a little bit of green staining, and that's because she was buried with these enormous brooches that are like these huge pepper pots that were joined together by these really beautiful chain of glass beads. And she's also then had this bone comb which was placed behind her head. These are what are called Germanic objects, so they're found in Roman Germany, across continental Europe, where we know that people from Germany are being stationed with the military. By looking at your dental enamel, the white hard dental enamel, we were able to show that she was actually born outside of Britain, so she's probably spent her early childhood in the German area of Europe. So she's someone who grew up on the continent, has a very visible expression of her community, came to London, then she was buried with all of her cultural signifiers, which is really nice because then we see that elsewhere in Roman Britain towards the end there's this very clear expression of German identity.
So which of the cemeteries in Roman London was she actually buried in?
She was buried in the Eastern Cemetery. That area seems to be used in late London as well, whereas other areas seem to kind of go out of use a bit more. This time in London we're getting these very high status burials like Spitalfields Roman woman because she's quite late on in the chronology. So, and although London seems to be becoming smaller in size, actually you still have these people who have these continental connections, who are very wealthy, and they're still expressing their community and traditions in a way that would be recognisable to people from other parts of the Roman Empire.
It is burials like this one that can reveal so much about those that lived in later Roman London. Many evidently prospered, but the overarching story of London between the late 3rd and early 5th centuries is one of gradual decline. One key event in this diminishing occurred near the end of the 3rd century, orchestrated by a Roman usurper, a pirate king, Corus. The year is AD 286. The Emperor Maximian in the west decides that because there's no Roman navy in Britain anymore, the North Sea is being overrun by piracy, Germanic piracy. And therefore the Emperor gets one of his best admirals, Corus, to mount a naval operation to clear the North Sea of piracy. But he does such a good job that the Emperor accuses him of actually siding with the pirates, being a traitor, and he orders his execution. So Corus usurps and he comes to Britain. And Corus decides that he wants to keep the Romans out, so he actually starts minting coins. He creates the first minting proper coins in Roman Britain, sometime around AD 290. On the coins, he has his own face, and then he has the face of Maximian, who's the emperor in the west, and also the emperor in the east, Diocletian. So he's trying to say, I'm just as powerful an emperor as the other two existing emperors in the imperial centre. But he knows they're going to come for him. So therefore, he builds a series of forts around the coast of Britain, some of which later become the Saxon shore forts. But also, he builds the river wall to close the land circuit built by Septimius Severus. When the river wall is built, there are no more ragstone quarries operating in the Medway Valley, so there's no new stone to use. So therefore, because he builds this wall in a hurry to keep Romans out, he knocks down all the grand mausolea and all the grand funerary monuments outside the town. He knocks down many of the fine public buildings in London itself, and he reuses the stone. Many of those stones have got inscriptions naming the governors, the procurators, the key people of earlier Roman London, and we only know their names because they were later reused building the Corusian river wall. So behind me you actually get a sense of three of the phases of the fortification of Roman London. Firstly, the Cripplegate Fort. Secondly, built on top of it, the Severn Land Wall. And finally, when Corus built the river wall, he also built a series of bastions bolted on to the outside of the original Severn Land Wall. That's one of them right there. Much of that stone is original Roman stone. Corus invested heavily in defences to protect his breakaway empire, but things didn't end well for this usurper. In AD 293, Corus was assassinated by his chancellor, who was called Electus. And then you have 3 years, the final 3 years of what was called their North Sea Empire, before this recalcitrant part of the Roman Empire was dragged kicking and screaming back into the Roman imperial fold. And that was carried out by Constantius Chlorus, who was the junior emperor, the Caesar, in the west. Now, Constantius Chlorus celebrated his victory by minting a coin which tells an amazing story about Roman London, because he arrived just in the nick of time to save London from being sacked by the Germanic Frankish mercenaries who were fighting for Electus. Here we can see the earliest ever pictorial representation of London, and it's called the Arras Medallion. London returned to the imperial fold, but there will be no new golden age for this Roman city. Instead, over the next few decades, London will experience a gradual decline.
It's actually much harder for archaeologists to tell what was going on, because the later part of Roman London's history is often the bit that's chopped away by Victorian basements and things, so we have less of it. But also we have less of it because there was less of it. We know that London is really thriving in the 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, and then gradually there's a sort of slow period of decline. The port disappears, big stone buildings become abandoned, we've got archaeological evidence that they start sort of falling down and collapsing, and presumably people are moving away, either into the countryside where they perceive it safer, or perhaps returning to where they may have originally come from, their families originally come from. The Roman administration ceases in AD 410, right across the Western Roman Empire. Essentially London is on its own, there's no government to protect anyone, there's no military, and that is the end, effectively, of Roman London.
Roman London had met its end. Its legacy, however, lives on.
It's so important to learn about London's Roman history because London was founded by the Romans. Just understanding what they built, where, what their lives were like, it gives us a different perspective, a really exciting perspective on why the city is how it is. And also it changes your view on what it is to be British or English or whatever. This was a very diverse, different population which created our city. I think it's amazing to learn more about that and to find it, and it's just exciting as well.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.